Welcome to our latest episode with Louis Christopher from SQM Research to discuss the trends in the property market. Today, we're discussing do's and don'ts in the property market, Louis' advice and tips and tricks for any new investors or current investors. And we'll explore kind of some of the popular themes and things that people do when purchasing property. So, Louis, let's just start with, I guess, the beginning of the process, which is when people start looking at property. They tend to go on listings websites. What are the details that generally clients should look at when they're first analysing a property?
Well, I think the first thing clients, home buyers, investors is they need to understand what their budget is. This is really important. Too often I see people go over their budget when buying a home, either for emotional reasons or just getting frustrated with the market. So first things first, understand your actual budget and work within the budget. That's really important. Uh, the next thing I think people can do is when they're investigating a property, let's say, for example, they're after a four-bedroom home in certain locations, they're very easy to actually sort of bring up those criteria on listings websites, and listings websites make that very easy for you. The key, though, is you want to understand through your inspections the real quality of the property. That's really important. So that means, for example, getting site and pest inspections, maybe getting a builder that you know to have a look at the property. That's what I've done in the past at times. That's really, really important. Every property is going to have some type of defect. What's important is that you don't end up with a nasty surprise after you've bought the property.
Are there any terms just adding to that, particularly when you're looking at a listing? This is before you've actually visited the property.
Yeah.
Are there any terms that people should be looking out for if they're looking at their first purchasing their first property or maybe their first investment?
In terms like terms and conditions in a contract.
No, I'm talking about language used in, let's say, the description on a listing.
Okay, sure. Well, we've discussed in the past distress listings, so certain keywords which are being used to describe a distress listing. Find out, of course, if how long the property's been on the market.
Mhm.
That's usually quite important because the longer it's been on the market, the opportunity there is potentially for a bargain, and over and above that, the requirement to do over and above due diligence, because there could actually be something wrong with the property that others have actually discovered. So that's important as well. Um, Obviously, if the property is going to auction, you want to know when the auction is on. You want to try and get really what the real guide is off the agent. And the best way to do that is when you go to your first inspection, just try and find out from the agent what the vendor is really seeking. You know, what's the minimum they're seeking. Sometimes you'll see there's a price guide, but we're all familiar with underquoting. And you really want to reduce time spent on a property where you've just got no chance of buying.
Absolutely. And kind of to that question, and obviously we discuss people buying over budget, but other than budget, what are sort of the faux pas that people commit when they're sort of purchasing a property, residential versus investment? Are there any things that you sort of see that people do when they're going in to buy a property that they really shouldn't be doing?
Yeah, overpaying for a property over and above their budget, that can cause immediate distress over the next 12, 24 months or longer. If you've overpaid for a property, makes it harder, of course, to get a return on the property if you've overpaid for it as well. And then along with that, becoming too emotionally invested into a property. I think people often look at homes as like, this is the one. This is the one, and there can be no others. Like as though they're forming a relationship with someone.
Mm.
Okay, there'll always be another property that comes up which fits the bill. There always will be. So it's important not to get too emotionally attached to a property when you're out there and you're looking.
Mm. Yeah, definitely. And what is When you've got, say, an investor for a client, what's one metric that most people believe drives capital growth, but in reality has a bit of a minimal impact? So it could be like a location of where a property is, or
Oh, look, location is still quite useful. There's no question about that. Um, I think people I emphasize fixtures and fittings, for example, on new properties. So the thing is, when it comes to a new property, like say new apartment, they often command a premium in the marketplace because all the fixtures and fittings are new, everything's modern and so forth. But those are not the items which actually appreciate in value. It's the underlying land. Those new fixtures and fittings will actually eventually depreciate in value because of wear and tear. So people need to keep that in mind and not get too caught up in the bling.
absolutely. And I was going to say, kind of to that point, you know, generally, I think a lot of people see that an apartment is a riskier investment than, a standalone home because there's no land attached to it. Um, what are some of the things when you're looking to, say, purchase an apartment? What are the do's and don'ts for apartment purchasing? You mentioned, overcapitalizing on properties that have new fixtures and things. Are there any other things that people should be aware of if they're looking to, say, purchase an apartment instead of, because they may not be able to afford a standalone house?
Well, for starters, people need to recognize that the risks can often be greater the newer the apartment. So if you're buying off the plan, okay, you are taking on a number of risks that people who are buying existing property are not taking on. So you're taking on building risk, for example. You're taking on the risk of the developer going bankrupt, as another example. You're taking on timing risk. If you have intentions to move into that property by such and such a date, you're dependent on that building being completed on time. So when it comes to newer properties like such as off the plan, the risk can actually be quite high. And then for units, they often mitigate the older the property is. That said, though, very old units could still have some maintenance issues. One thing that I always do when considering maybe buying a unit um, is generally when it comes to existing properties, I will look at the strata minutes. I want to get my hands on the minutes of the body corporate. I want to know what's been going on with the property. What have the owners been in dispute about, for example? You want to know all that nitty gritty stuff. And you can ask of that. You can ask that off the agent.
I think that's something that a lot of people know they can do when they're purchasing, an apartment. I haven't heard of a lot of people I know that when they've bought apartments, I don't think they ask for the strata minutes, so I think that's a bit of a top tip.
Yeah, absolutely. Get yourself a copy of the strata minutes. And if they're not willing to give it to you, that should be a bit of a red flag.
What do you find, and what have we seen in the data around what are things that people are investing in generally, and then they're investing in it because it's been historically good, or maybe there's a theme around it being good, but typically have pretty subpar returns that most people think are a good investment.
Oh, I would have to actually jump over to the commercial side or anything else. So one of the things that comes to mind is, for example, office units.
Mm,
They've generally not performed as well in the last 10 years as perhaps some other property asset classes. So that's what immediately comes to mind. The areas which have done generally quite well have been in outer ring capital city areas across Australia, namely Brisbane, Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, Adelaide as well, Tasmania up until recently. It's been an affordability play more than anything else.
mm,
Whereas I remember, for example, in the 1990s and the early 2000s, within coastal areas were actually the outperforming areas in Australia. Whether they be city coastal areas or outer city coastal areas, there was generally strong outperformance. But now it seems as though it's been more the affordable areas have been the outperforming areas. and the more affluent areas, less so performing.
Fascinating. And sort of to that around performance, I remember we were having a pretty interesting conversation the other day around corner blocks.
Oh, yes.
People looking to purchase corner blocks. I remember you mentioning that it's not something you would necessarily advise, but
Yeah.
it's a pretty popular.
Yeah. There's a big notion out there. Corner blocks could be a good investment because potentially you could subdivide the block in the future, and that might well still be true. My personal experience of corner blocks, because I've actually lived in a couple of them, is that they are generally exposed to traffic. I believe if there were sets put up together, they'd be more exposed to the risk of burglary as well. I've known quite a few people who own corner blocks have been burgled. Uh, so yeah, these are some of the things which I've generally stayed clear on. I mean, in the end, each to their own. There may well be opportunities in corner blocks, but if I was investing, no, I wouldn't be buying a corner block.
Okay, Louis. So, on a slightly different topic, but I think it is important for our listeners to hear because a lot of our listeners will be trying to use property data and potentially even qualitative reports around to inform them of purchases. As a data house ourselves, what is the danger of putting together qualitative reports and solely utilizing them to purchase property?
I think when you're looking at a locality or you're looking just to get more intelligence, you should get it from multiple sources. Property data does have its limitations. Getting hearsay from on the ground can also have its limitations as well due to biases and so forth. Um, I think the combination of, say, trusted people on the ground, such as a property valuer or maybe an agent you can trust, plus the data is the best path forward, knowing the limitations of each. That's really important. So, on the data side, obviously, data is objective, but it can give out false positives. For example, a situation where a property supposedly has gone up by 50% and, over a 12-month period, that can simply occur because of an artificial rise in the median household unit price. So I think it's a combination of the two. There's no perfect source out there. And I think that's what we need to all keep in mind. What we do at SQM Research, of course, is we do provide a postcode snapshot report, which contains quite a lot of data at the locality level. And I think that's useful, but I wouldn't just solely rely on it. I would also get information on the ground.
The final question I wanted to ask you is a little bit around is a question around what would you suggest would be a blueprint 10-year strategy for a novice investor? Say you've purchased your first investment property, you're about to. What's a good 10-year blueprint that someone could follow?
Well, 10 years is an ideal time to hold a property for starters. I wouldn't recommend holding a property or buying a property with a view you're going to sell it within 5 years because of the transaction cost to begin with are proportionally higher over that shorter time frame than a longer time frame. So that's number one. It's very hard, for example, in this country to what they call flip properties, where you turn them over quickly after you've done a reno because of these transaction costs. If I had a 10-year investment time horizon, I would buy a property, an investment property. This is assuming I already own my principal place of residence, and there's good. And that's on a conservative loan to value ratio. I would use that capital I built up in my principal place to go and buy a second property. I would buy in an area that I would know reasonably well, but I would diversify away from where my principal place of residence is. And once again, I'd be buying within my budget. I would be not just paying interest only on that investment property, I'd be paying principal and interest to build up capital in that property. Once the loan to value ratio gets down to a conservative level and that property is delivering positive cash flow in a genuine sense, then I would consider another investment property and I would slowly build from there. In all this, property is a long term game. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. It's okay to own just say one investment property. It's even okay not to own any investment properties. Having your principal place of residence is usually going to be your biggest asset to begin with. And in this world, it's best to diversify. But yeah, that's probably how I would approach things.
Well, thank you very much, Louis. Appreciate your time there. And for everybody else, please have a look at our property snapshot. Sorry, our postcode snapshot, which you can have a look at some of those reports around the postcodes. We also have Property Explorer as well, which is our automated valuation tool where you can look at our predictions around individual properties and how we value those properties. Until next time, guys, thank you so much.